একদম মানে যিনি ওরা ব্যাক ভার্জিন ফরেস্ট জুম গলিও অদ মানে একারি জুম গলিয়ে বহুত মানে দান ফাজে তো পাচ্ছ বছর দি বছর হয়তো হেদাক মানে হনো যেন হলো ইয়ান গলিয়ে এবছর তারপরে বছর আরো একজন কোনো পার্মানেন্ট দিয়ে না হলো যে প্ল্যান্টেশন না হলো দরকারও নেই মানে উর্বর লাগেলে হলো এক করে মানে ইয়ে ভার্জিন কোনোদিন মানে ইয়ে নয় বহু একশত বছর ধরে মানে ইউরি আগে উর্বর হয়ে মধ্যে জুম করলে আর হয়ে পাই
The formal annexation came in 1860, where the Chittagong Hill Tracts was given the status of a separate district.
The idea that a number of the hills between the Chittagong coast on the west and the Irrawaddy Valley, which is now central Burma, that was had a particular name, didn't exist. These hills just continued and various peoples lived there. It was only when the British moved in and conquered a little bit of these hills, they had to give it a name and they called it the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
For the first time, a non-Jumma, a non-indigenous official was ever posted in the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
So the Chittagong Hill Tracts as a unit is just a colonial administrative invention.
বর্তমানে যে পার্বত্য চট্টগ্রাম বাংলাদেশের অংশ এটা তো হচ্ছে সাউথ এশিয়া এবং সাউথ ইস্ট এশিয়ার মধ্যে একটা ব্রিজের মতো একটা সেতু বন্ধন মেলবন্ধন
Chakmas and Tochingas speak Indo-European language, but the other 9 tribes or indigenous they speak Sino-Tibetan languages. So this is the place where two great culture actually touches each other.
এখানে যে মানুষেরা বসবাস করেন তারা চেহারায় তাদের ভাষায় তাদের কৃষ্টিতে সংস্কৃতিতে সব কিছুতে তারা একদম আলাদা যেখানে আপনি পছন্দ হয় যে জায়গাতে আপনার পছন্দ থাকে তবে এখানে আমি জম অবশ্য করবেন তবে জম করলে হয় না এটা তো আমাদের ইচ্ছা মানে কি কারণ তা আমার এই জমে আমি এক বছর জম করবেন তাহলে মাটি নিয়ে এরাই কম মাত হবে মাথাতে ওই মাটি তারপরে কি স্বপ্ন কি দেখে স্বপ্ন যদি খারাপ দেখে এই জমটা আমার দরকার না আমার করবে না স্বপ্ন যদি এটা হলো ভালো যদি পায় ওই তেল বিক্রি করে পাবেন মরিচ বিক্রি করে পাবেন আদা হলুদ বিক্রি করে পাবেন আর ধান পাবেন পেঁপে কুনসিকুলা বা মানমা আর তারপরে বিভিন্ন শাক সবজি এটা পাবেন এটা হলো স্বপ্ন দেখবে তো স্বপ্নকে কি আকুন দেখে তারপরে ওই চকরি চকরা সাপ দেখে তারপরে এটা হলো এই সময় আমার না মিট হবে না এটা তো আমার চুম করে দরকার নাই
Traditionally they are Sweden cultivators, which means slash and burn cultivation, which obviously depends on land, but land with forests.
The idea that underlies hill agriculture is rights in land, but not the sort of rights that you have in a sort of a Western system, or even the Mughal land system that existed before the British came in the plains.
Kada mela jaga jian mane abad gore jian mane nijor ejo se dhorono yeruji dekan prothagoto yeruji oitijjo ai chakma unor jian mane abad gore jian thar se dhorono
জায়গাতে বাক করেন ধরেন তারপরে একটা হেডম্যান মুংসা হেডম্যানকে জনগণকে একটা জায়গা লাগবে, তারপরে আমাকে জানাই দিবেন কারবারি হিসাবকে। তো আমাদের একটা জায়গা নেবেন 6 একর অথবা নইলে 5 একর অথবা নইলে 3 একর, নাকি 33 শ্রেণী নাকি প্রথম শ্রেণী নাকি 2 শ্রেণী, এরকমটা নিয়ে ওই যারা জায়গা নেবে উনি আলোচনা করেন সহকিরা দিয়ে, তারপরে হেডম্যানকে যাবে, তারপর ওনার জায়গা এই জায়গা আমি পছন্দ হয় ওই জায়গাটা ওনাকে দেওয়া হবে।
যে জমিতে তারা জুম চাষ করে, যে জমিতে তারা শিকার করে, যে জমিতে তারা শত শত বছর ধরে নিশ্চিন্তে বসবাস করে আসছে, সেখানে তো তাদের কোনো দলিল নেই, তাদের কোনো কিছু নেই, কিন্তু ওই জমির উপরে তাদের যে ট্র্যাডিশনাল রাইটস সেটা তারা ভোগ করে আসছে সবসময়।
If you read the earliest information on where you get people from the hill tracts actually speaking and talking about their life, it's very clear that they talk about, this is our village. We have a right to divide this land among us. We can say, okay, you go plant that hill and you go plant that hill. Others don't have that right to come in. So there is a sense of this belongs to us, not necessarily to me as a person, but to us as a group. So that idea has always been there.
আদিবাসীরা তাদের যে ভূমির সাথে জঙ্গলের সাথে যে সম্পর্ক সেটা হচ্ছে তাদের অন্তরের সম্পর্ক। এখানে কাগজপত্রের কোনো সম্পর্ক নেই।
The first was a British gentleman called Captain MacGrath. So he was the first superintendent of the hill tracts, but he supervised. He didn't administer. Administration was still in the hands of the Rajas, Dewans, and so forth.
Occupation of the Chittagong Hill Tracts created a number of problems for administration. The British had to decide whether they wanted to control the tracts directly by putting a lot of British administrators in, or do it indirectly by having local people control the population for them.
Of course, their interest was to get the highest possible revenue and to do it with the least possible cost. And what is the cheapest way to administer a region? Have their own people rule them.
So what they did is they chose 3 chiefs who sat on the major rivers of the Chittagong Hill Tract and made them into the 3 Rajas of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. The Mong Raja in the north, the Chakma Raja in the middle, and the Bomong Raja in the south. Another way in which it changed the system is they took over large tracts of land and took them under direct control of the forest department. So they tried to remove the people living there in order to exploit the forest reserves directly.
The British imported teak saplings from then Burma and converted large tracts of heterogeneous forest, biodiverse forests, into monoplantations of teak.
ভালো ক্যাশ পাওয়া যায় বা এই কাঠের মূল্য আছে, কাঠ বৃক্ষ হিসেবে সেগুনের খুব মূল্য আছে, কিন্তু পরিবেশের জন্য এটা মোটেও ভালো না, এবং এই সেগুনও বাইরের মানুষকে অনেকটা আকৃষ্ট করে যে ওখানে সেগুন চাষ করা যায়।
These were theoretically off limits to people, But of course, now even the writ of the British government, or any government for that fact, doesn't really enter into every nook and corner of a forest area.
It was noted by the colonial administrators that another problem was coming up, and that was that traders from the plains were moving into the hills in larger numbers than they had before. There had always been people from the plains in the hills, but very small numbers. Now they were increasing, and the British were worried about the locals getting indebted to these traders. And that, they thought, was not a good prospect, again, for colonial taxation and so on. So they tried to prohibit plains people moving into the hills and sort of acting as a middle layer between the colonials and the locals. That's why the Chittagong Hill Tracts regulation of 1900 was devised, to separate the hills from the plains and to set up this other system that they found more useful.
Now, for the British, the Chittagong Hill Tracts regulation meant that you did not apply all those complex land laws, tax laws, court procedure laws to this region.
The CHT regulation of 1900 was used by the British colonial administration to give absolute power over land to the central state bureaucracy. And this was manifested in the office of the Deputy Commissioner, the DC. Now, there were the local office holders for land management as well. So the three circle chiefs, and then the headmen, the village headmen under them, and under the headmen, the karbaris. But ultimately, even the chiefs, their power was subordinate to that of the Deputy Commissioner. But then this is also the regulation which recognizes partially the customary rights of the hill peoples.
It doesn't actually tell you indigenous peoples have the right to swidden or shifting cultivation, but it indirectly acknowledges the continuance of a practice and a right.
This became the first time that the people in the hills started thinking about themselves as a separate group, rather than as people who happen to live in this particular hill area or that particular hill area, or people speaking this language or that language, or having this religion or that religion. Because they were now under one regulation and separated from the plains, they started thinking about themselves as being part of one social unit for the first time. That developed very slowly, but it became very important. And also on the other side, the plains people started to think of them more and more as being outside of their world. British India fell apart in 1947. The British found it more and more difficult to control the colony and finally decided to give it up. But it was not so clear who they could hand power over to. In other colonies, this was usually quite clear. You had an anti-colonial nationalist movement that threw up leadership, and these leaders would then get to be the new presidents or whatever they would be of the independent states. In India, this didn't work out. You had competing groups, and the end game of colonial rule in the second half of the 1940s was extremely complicated, but it turned out that the decision was made to partition the colony, to cut it in pieces. The parts where Muslims were in the majority separated from all the other parts.
Everyone assumed that the hill tracts would be awarded to India. So the question of Pakistan did not enter anybody's head at all. But in any case, you see, it was not so much a question of whether they felt that India would necessarily be a better place than Pakistan. But the question was that Pakistan was created on the whole idea that it was a nationhood for Muslim people. So the whole idea of a state in which a certain denomination would get a privileged provision. So I suppose there were serious concerns how the non-Muslim indigenous peoples would feel in a state which had the notion of nationhood for a certain religion.
At one point, the British decided when the colony was going to be decolonized, middle of August 1947. 6 weeks before that, they installed boundary commissions, one for the Punjab in the west, one from Bengal and Assam in the east. The commission consisted of 2 members from the Indian National Congress, 2 members from the All India Muslim League, and a chairman from Britain. These commissions were given the task to divide these provinces. Now, 6 weeks to do a job like that is an impossible task. In the end, the Commission for Bengal and Assam couldn't decide how to cut things up, so they said, okay, the chair has to make the final decisions, and this he did. So when independence occurred, most people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts thought they had become Indians. Very interestingly, the decisions of the Bengal Boundary Commission were not made public at the time of independence, but a few days later. So for a few days there was total confusion. People in the Chittagong Hill Tract, they thought they were in India, and they were very happy that the British had gone, so they were celebrating. And what do you do when you celebrate? You show the symbols of the new state to which you belong, independent state.
Radcliffe awarded the Hill Tracts to Pakistan, and I think around the 17th, the Pakistan army came and brought down the Indian flag and put up the Pakistani flag.
Ever since, there's been enormous controversy about the decision. Very interestingly, Cyril Radcliffe never talked about the reasons that informed his decision. The Muslim population of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in 1947 was, I think, something like 2 or 4%. So there's no reason on the basis of Muslim majority decision making to put it with Pakistan. So people have been asking why. Now, if you look at what the commission was told to do, it was told to separate Muslim majority areas from non-Muslim majority areas, and to take into account other factors. Now, the other factors were not defined, so people have been sort of guessing what they might have been. It was also a time, if we talk about the Chittagong Hill Tracts, that had far-reaching effects, because the Pakistan state, then taking in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, used this little moment of confusion to show that the people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts were traitors to Pakistan. They wanted to be Indians and so on, and this has continued as a sort of a discourse about the Chittagong Hill Tracts ever since.
প্রায় মুখে মুখে ওই যে হয়তো মানে পূর্বরু চুনো নাই ওই জন্য তো সিয়ন দই হাততাইয়া গোটা দেখা ইয়র সেকা তো সিয়ন দই আমিও সিয়ে নাই ছাত্র মানে ছাত্র জীবন দেয় 세사의 전도도 했군요. 어때? 인도 비체 너로 이제 두이 보이니 보전에 비체 너로도 해도 오늘도 수능 노자이도 내가 노자이 막 건나 우리 고다디네 때지 라이발이고
UNESCO atamnang redi saka classic sat puri ne huri saka do khatte goda bane ta UNESCO side ingreji ta khatte godan first ek phola bani ta bani ne bani abar phanian humi atamnang redi side bani ne bani phanian humi di ta side ta puro bani de ta side ta edo mani jo ichun saka phoram phirene de ta ami last e basito ingreji ichedi.
Because of the cross dam across the Karnapuli River, a huge reservoir was created, which is known as the Kaptai Lake, and this submerged a huge area of the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
প্রায় 2 মের মানে এরিয়ার মধ্যে তুলবান গ্রামান এলো বিভোর সাম্মারসন কাপ্তাই দি মরা আইনি অবস্থায় ভালো বেকুনোর বছৰৰ প্ৰায় খৰাগিত এলো এনে স্বয়ং সম্পূৰ্ণ হ'লে পাৰে
All the fertile paddy lands in the river valleys of the Karnapuli River and its tributaries were submerged, and in effect the best paddy lands were simply lost. They were destroyed, so to speak. And this was a major shock to the land system in the hill tracts. With the Kaptai Dam, about 100,000 indigenous peoples were evicted from their lands.
Baba don't know the itra saka abin hanungo back mo mutelabu adot ta hode tu foroman fire tu jo foroma de hote na ta baba na foroman fire ne ta abi du bui banga che ne agi ti
You then begin to feel the shock effects of creating this dam, because the people who go into the forests still need to survive. So they start cutting down the reserve forests and they start cultivating either Sweden cultivation or wet rice cultivation. Whichever way they do it, it means that pressure is now put on the forest lands, which was not the case before this. We're talking about half of 100,000 people, about 50,000 people needing to find alternative lands to survive in the forests.
For many of them, it was very hard to find a place to live, and quite a large number of them left Pakistan and went to India, hoping to find a place there.
Where until now, most of them have not been given citizenship rights, and their right to live in as residents of the state is challenged by the indigenous people of that state. So there's a lot of memory there for people who lived there, grew up. Actually, my uncle, my father's brother, who died recently, wrote a song about Oi Dagonni Singi Duar. Jio Takere je Badar Sefu Gidi Gangosong Mudde, Elamoadam. He was my village to the east of the reserve bazaar where my village was before the dam. So that's one thing, and that's a lesson to a lot of people. Let's think now how much electricity is being produced, but what did it do to the people, what does it do to the environment, and so forth. That's something we should bear in mind.
Feelings ran high in Dhaka, the capital of East Pakistan. It is a city of about 500,000 people, Bengalis, very different in language, outlook and culture from the West Pakistanis. The two regions are more than 1,000 miles apart on the opposite sides of India. They were linked together in a makeshift arrangement 24 years ago at the time of the breakup of the British Empire in India. They had little in common but the Muslim faith and the fear of domination by Hindu India. And they have been somewhat uneasy bedfellows as a single state of Pakistan ever since.
Movement for more rights in East Pakistan took the form of a language movement. This is what mobilized people, the fact that the Bengali language was not given the weight in the state of Pakistan that it should have, because the majority of people in Pakistan, East and West, were Bengali speaking, but the state language was not Bengali, but Urdu. So the movement for East Pakistani autonomy and later independence was a movement for Bengali autonomy and independence, which made the people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts very marginal, because they are not Bengali speaking, they're also not Urdu speaking. In this big game, they were onlookers in a way. So when 71 war happened, many people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts were not sure what would be the best outcome for them. They had not been treated very well during the Pakistan period, but could they expect to be treated better during in an independent Bengali nation, Bengali state? When the representatives of the Chittagong Hill Tracts in the new Bangladesh parliament started making claims for their area, they did not get much support from the huge Bengali majority of other members. The fact that after what happened in 47, when the people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts didn't get what they were expecting, and again in 71 when they didn't get, or 72 or 73 when they didn't get what they expected, again the sort of disillusionment and the fact that they felt in this new state we're not going to be treated as equals, and we have to fight for our rights. You could have thought of a situation where once armed struggle starts, the government then says, okay, let's go back to the table and negotiate. This didn't happen, so the conflict escalated, the area became highly militarized, and it became sort of a situation where the two parties were locked in a system where they couldn't get out of. So the fighting went on and on and on for more than 2 decades.
But they also find that they cannot win the war in a military way. So then they decide that they will try another strategy, and this strategy is the strategy of demographic engineering. And what they do is to bring in about 300,000 to 400,000 Bengali settlers from outside. That is more or less the same number of people as the indigenous peoples in the Chittagong Hill Tracts.
Sian alada CHT English ta itu to amar dagar hajanit boichon bangal ta bangalun boini ta sokka do dore dore thei ta undi la dojando ei mode jaga harilon ekkara mode mone gor eyen mo buyen gurulo also dai to kori biri no bana to kori kola gai lagan buye barot ei nitto khojjo dan surguri ni jan phosabire surguri ni jan thei no bari edu muto yoga bijoro olot khangdok olot tani yone ji yondo tai en gora ori kata jara di bangalun jara itun ki gocho garam kore logo indi go ki kham bedilem na ki on sigun boji yegi die ta sigun boji niye ka sot sana gocho garam kore to yegoi ei sotun hamla koron ta sotun aro sotun ei sotun eta army ejon তারপরে আছে বেদিলিয়ান এজন তারা এটো করি এজন তা মানুষজনে ধরে যেতে নবারন এদে দেতে উদ্দিবিচলে হাকন করা তেরে তোলা করা তুন্দেই ও ফসাবিরে নিজ লুবে যেন বাড়ি কাজ যে ইদু বাই বাই যে কাকু আগে তাই ওই জায়গা জমির কাকু আগে তা গরু ছাগল দুই কথান এসু নিতে দূরতা সরে যেন বাড়ি ডাইরেক্ট যেন বাড়ি তাই না না বাধ্যই সে জায়গা ছাড়তে বাধ্য হয়ে ফেলাম
So what you have is a situation of hundreds of thousands of Bengalis coming into the hill tracts, people who often didn't know what they were landing up in. They were poor people from other parts of the country who were not aware often of what was going on in the hill tract, but were very interested in the land that they thought they would get. They ended up in a war situation. They got protection from the army to stick to their land. It created a new dynamic in what was already a war.
তা বিদেশি ফিরেছি ইংরেজি তাই এনে সেটেলার আনি আনি আমার জায়গানি জুরে বুঝে দিয়ে সরকার দিয়ে আমাদের লড়ে লড়াই তা তারা ইয়ে নবারণ আমিও ভারতত শরণার্থী যাবি তা সিঁদুর লঙ্গ 8 বছর সন্মান তা শিবিরেনি বানি লং লম্বা উড়ে এক কান করত নহলে ঠিক পাতিক পরিবার মাত্র জনাভিয়ে দিয়ে হদক 14 ইঞ্চি এসে তো রইয়ে দিয়ে আপলে উইলে জেনে দাও হবার নয় ডেলি ফুরি হইতে 14 জন নিত্য হানা দেখে মরা দে মরা সবে সহ্য নয় জানা এসে হত্যা রইয়ে দিয়ে
মুই ফোনে জিয়ঙে তিননু তে থার খর দালে অকু ফেদ দাগে একু তিননু নে জঙে গো মোবাইল নিয়ে দিবে মফু তা সিগুন দই মুই দাদে উইসত চেনে থা হাকে ফিনন বুদ্ধি করে হাকে সল বুদ্ধি করে মুই জঙে হাকে মুরিবে জুগুলে দে এন কথা মুই ইন্দি সিগুন দই দুমুজুং থা চেনে উবনা ইন্দি গো দনা লামে গই দিয়ে সে দনাবো থাদগাতা পলে আগে গই দিয়ে ও ফানি ভরে গই গাডো জিয়ে গই এই জত থাদগাতা পলে যা দে এই জত না বাঙালু রুগুরি জেনে জত তারা লাপিয়ে গই
মুই গর্বাবু দিয়ে বইতাইলুম এই জিবে বিজি তোলা তো বলো ই এই জিবে ফেদ দাল তা সে উড়ে দিছিবে মহর দাল বাঙালা হব ওরে হইচন দিব না একজনা মোরা সুপিয়েও দে এই সিবে যা এক খুব দে দে মাম্মা কং মাম্মা গিনে আজুর উড়ে মাম্মা গিনে মাম ন দে থা জকা বর্মা থালো ন দার থা এদিক করে ফাইতুম ঠেঙা ইয়া আত্তা নাই এ আত্তা ন জকা ফাইতুম এ দিয়ে দে থাকো লান এক খুব একটু মাদি হুম না দেয়া দাবা দিয়া
Government of Bangladesh came into being in 71 and was seen worldwide as a victim of state violence, as a government that needed a lot of support from all over the world to help overcome decades of exploitation and then a devastating war. The Chittagong Hill Tracts War, you can call it that, from 1975 basically to 1997, really damaged that image of Bangladesh in the world. Because as information came out that there were massacres going on in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, that the Bangladesh army was targeting civilians, bringing them together in what they called cluster villages and so on. The idea that Bangladesh was a democratic state, where a people's republic, where the ills of the past were not going to be repeated, was tarnished.
And in a very short period, between 1979 and 1991, roughly 10-12 years, the demographic composition is drastically changed. Before 1979, the composition of outsiders was about 10% or less. But by 1991, the Bengali settlers who were brought in began to account for about half of the population of the hill tracts. And most Most disturbingly, what is also done by the government, by the military and the civil service, is that they redistribute the lands of the indigenous peoples to the Bengali settlers. Now, they cannot actually do this legally because that land is either private property or it is common property, but in both cases these are recognized by laws dating back to the British colonial period. So in effect what happens is that the government breaks the very property rights that it is supposed to defend. And this is the core of the conflict in the Hill Tracts. Because without the land, the indigenous peoples find that their survival is threatened. During the period of counterinsurgency, in addition to the settlers, lands of the hill peoples is also grabbed by other agencies. The biggest land grabber in the Chittagong Hill Tracts is the Forest Department. After the Forest Department, the security forces are the biggest land grabbers for their cantonments, their military installations. And surprisingly, it's not just the infantry or the army. Even the Air Force feels that it needs to take over land for its training purposes. The artillery groups, the other branches of the army that you don't really think would be able to use or would not be appropriate for the hill tracts, have got huge amounts of lands, hundreds of thousands of acres of lands under various various invented needs.
আমি তো রয়ে যে এই চেয়ে হন গেলাই হন সুগত হন তাই যতক্ষণ পর্যন্ত আমার যে শান্তি শৃঙ্খলা ফিরি নেওয়া যায় ততক্ষণ পর্যন্ত থাকব এই জেলান্ডি এই চুক্তি স্বাক্ষর হয়ে থাকছি দিয়ে আমি
The idea was to untie a very complicated knot that had come up in the 70s, 80s and 90s. There was a lot of international pressure on the Bangladesh government. They were actually pushed to the negotiation table. After long deliberations, the treaty was signed by both sides.
বর্তমান বিশ্ব শান্তির দিকে এগিয়ে যাচ্ছে সেখানে আমাদের দেশের ভিতরে আমাদের এই সীমারেখায় অশান্তি থাকবে এটা কারো জন্যই কাম্য ছিল না আর তো কিছু পরে এটা সমিতি অফিসিয়ালি তেমন ঠিক নাম এটা তো শান্তি চুক্তি তো বলা হবে অবশ্যই ফাইনাল পিস ট্রিটি এটা এটা তো এখন থেকেই বাস্তবায়ন আবার কি যখনই হলো তখন থেকেই বাস্তবায়ন আবার কতদিনে বাস্তবায়ন কি ধন্যবাদ
The state had a major role in breaking laws and grabbing land and bringing in settlers to whom they gave the lands of the Pahadis. This is what happened up to the 1990s primarily. But after the accord, the 1997 accord, what you see is that the direct interventions of the state, except the forest department, stops. But instead of the state agencies, it's now the private sector agency. And some of these private sector agencies include corporations, big, important, well-known corporations in Bangladesh, which have been involved in grabbing land with force, bringing in armed gangs, buying up the titles. But as I said, in many cases, they don't even use title documents. They just use force and their connections to keep the police and the administration away.
Cakatan kata hera ha biakin kumbani cakaya biar ropar mungba biakin sa kereta ropar ya biar tu cum no ya biar tu robar ya budi alam kumpani ya kelala kaya biar kumpani loy fly lo biar am kaca ya biar busu am kaca biar la kaya kumpani loy ye tapi biar sekon kaca la kaya biar kin kumpani loy ye untuk nanti ya imparato biar mi la kaya mi ya imparato biar kin fly nanti loy han ya biar tu kumpani cakaya ya biar tu kabar itu kelala kaya cawa biar tu kumpani loy biar
Beri manu ami te kisu no senelo. Ayere murat kareye tra kachala kaye. Tra ri kuriye. Dindin aye kumpani manu. Ria ropa kacai thmor si ole ya. Ekon upake kuriye am ni kisu ni la kaye. Hai. Murat no Thailand. Ami te khai jakan no Thailand. Thra na kare sum khaya
আগে তো এই সলো করো এরে সরো পরিবার আছে যে কুন্ডাই চাকা নাই এই বেলায় এখন তো আমি সাত পরিবার না থাকি এখন সাত পরিবার বসলে খাইতে চাকা নাই করতে পারে না আমি মরুংতে ফসো তো কিছু করতে পারে নাই মরুংতে ফসো তোমার দায় কইলে দায়ব তো এতলা আমার কইয়ে খন চাকা আমার দায়ব খরে আমি দায়ব দায় চাকালে নাই বেলায় আমি পাড়া কইয়ে খাবারে কইয়ে আমি তো চড়াই খরে দায়ব আমি তো চুক থাইতে এরে চুক থাকে এতে ইবিয়া বলে ত্রা বলে বেছি বয়ত আমি তোমার বয়ত খম রে ফুট তোলে বয়ত খম বলে আমি তোন চুক এরে নাতি নানা দাদা হয়া লাউতি থাই বসু বলে খম এন্ডেলে বলি মরুং তুনতে ত্রা তুন বলে বেছি বয়ত ত্রা বলে আকে কুরিয়ে ডাকায়া বিয়ালে আমি পাড়া কয়ে খাবারে ডাকায়া মানু বলে এরে নি চুক থাকে আমি ননি থাকে বলে ইবিয়া বলে ভাং এক টাকা লাউতি এরে থাকে মানুষ নাও ফাই খেন করিব মিকিয়া কয়ে ডিসি তুলে কয়ে তে খেন করিব ডিসিলে ন কইল
You have this situation of utter lawlessness in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, and it has worsened in recent years. In 2009, 2010, it has actually got worse. It's not got better.
চুক্তি তো হয়েছিল রাষ্ট্রের সঙ্গে, তার মানে যে সরকারই ক্ষমতায় থাকুক বাকি সরকারদেরও তো এটা বাস্তবায়নের জন্য এগিয়ে আসা উচিত ছিল, কিন্তু আমাদের দুর্ভাগ্যজনক হলো আমাদের দেশে তো সেরকম রাজনৈতিক সংস্কৃতি চালু হয় নাই। যেটা আওয়ামী লীগ চুক্তি করেছে বিএনপি এসে সেটা ফেলে রেখেছে। তারপর সেই সময়ে অবশ্য 3-3.5 বছর ক্ষমতায় ছিল আওয়ামী লীগ সরকার, যারা চুক্তি করেছিলেন। তারপরে আওয়ামী লীগের পরে তো বিএনপি সরকার ক্ষমতায় আসলো, তারা তো চুক্তিকেই বাতিল করতে চেয়েছিল, বা তারা তো চুক্তির সময় চুক্তির বিরোধিতা করেছিল। তারপর আরও 2 বছর তত্ত্বাবধায়ক সরকার, তো তাদের সময় তো চুক্তি বাস্তবায়ন হয় নাই। আবার 2009 সালে এই যে তারা ক্ষমতায় আসলো এবং অঙ্গীকার করলো যে চুক্তি বাস্তবায়ন করবে।
না, শান্তি চুক্তির ফলে যে সংঘর্ষটা চলছিল, যে বড় ধরনের ভীতি সবসময় মানুষের মধ্যে কাজ করেছে, সেটা একটু কমেছে। সেই জিনিসটা হয়তো নাই, কিন্তু পার্বত্য চট্টগ্রামে এখনও 300-র অধিক টেম্পোরারি সেনাবাহিনীর ক্যাম্প আছে, মিলিটারি ক্যাম্প আছে। সেটা তো মানুষের জন্য এখন একটা বড় থ্রেট। সেনাবাহিনীর ক্যাম্প থাকা মানেই হচ্ছে যে সেনাবাহিনী হয়তো আগের মতো শান্তিবাহিনী দমন করার নামে যখন তখন গ্রামে গিয়ে হামলা করছে না, কিন্তু সেনাবাহিনী ইজ ইকুয়ালি ইনভলভড। সব কিছুর মধ্যে সেনাবাহিনীর একটা রোল আছে। এবং শান্তি চুক্তির পরে যে জিনিসটা হয় নাই সেটা হচ্ছে যে ভূমি বিরোধ নিষ্পত্তি হয় নাই।
Since 1997, for nearly 1 decade, the Land Commission was not even activated. It sometimes had a chairman, but it had no staff, no money, no power to do anything, and the government kept it in this state, almost deliberately, one must say. So instead of the Land Commission being a factor, a force which redresses wrongs, which resolves illegal occupation and gives the land back to the original Paharis who owned it, instead of that happening, the activities of the Land Commission have been concerned with other things which will strengthen the rights of Bengalis occupying those lands.
আঞ্চলিক পরিষদকে শক্তিশালী করা, বলা যায় আঞ্চলিক পরিষদ আসলে ক্ষমতাহীন একটা প্রতিষ্ঠান, অথচ সবচেয়ে শক্তিশালী প্রতিষ্ঠান হওয়ার কথা এটা আঞ্চলিক পরিষদ।
The power to decide on land and land administration was supposed to have been transferred from the central government to the local government institutions created by the peace treaty. These were the Hill District Councils. It is now nearly 14 years since the peace treaty was signed. That power has not been transferred to the Hill District Council, and therefore the institutions of local self-government of the indigenous peoples do not have any authority over land transactions.
2010 সালে এসে একটা সুযোগ তৈরি হলো যে আপনার সংবিধান সংশোধনের পদক্ষেপ গ্রহণ করলো, তারা একটা কমিটি করে দিল। আমরা আশা করেছিলাম যে সরকার মোটামুটি এবার আদিবাসীদের সাংবিধানিক স্বীকৃতি দিবে, কিন্তু আমরা পরবর্তী সময়ে জানলাম যে সরকার আদিবাসীদের স্বীকৃতি দিচ্ছে, কিন্তু সেটা আদিবাসী হিসেবে না।
There is no objective kind of definition on indigenous. When the indigenous peoples finally got this international platform in the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, there was of course a long debate on the term indigenous. What should one call it? You can't define it on objective sociological, cultural, other criteria. You just take the issue. Could you say that a group has a specific language? There's a lot of groups who feel that they are still a cultural ethnic group who don't have their own language anymore. Can we then use culture? I mean, culture is the way we think about things, the way we do things, our values, our artistic expression, our knowledge. Now, you can't use that often because you may share a lot with your neighbors, or you may again have lost a lot of your traditional way of doing things. So you can't use the traditional way of life. Often you cannot use religion. So all this to say that there's no kind of objective criteria. And that's why the UN very, very wisely said, this is a question of self-definition. The people who say, we are a group, an indigenous group. We feel like a group, we have a common history, we have had a language, we have had culture. This is how we feel. And we want to be represented because we are marginalized and discriminated against in the state where we live. And the UN says, welcome into the family.
কোনো স্বাধীন রাষ্ট্র তার সীমানার ভেতরের জনগণ বা বিশেষ গোষ্ঠীকে কিভাবে সংজ্ঞায়িত করবে বা কিভাবে ক্যাটেগরাইজ করবে তা সেই দেশটির একান্তই নিজস্ব এখতিয়ার। এ ধরনের স্ট্যাটাস প্রদান সংবিধান ও জাতীয় আইনের আওতায় হয়ে থাকে। এক্ষেত্রে স্বাধীন রাষ্ট্রের উপর কোনো বিশেষ ক্যাটেগরি চাপিয়ে দেওয়ার কোনো মেকানিজম বা ম্যান্ডেট কোনো আন্তর্জাতিক ফোরাম এমনকি জাতিসংঘেরও নেই।
There's a whole discussion at the state level all over the world whether terms like indigenous people can be used. Especially Asian societies, Asian states have big trouble with that because they say we're all indigenous. What is more indigenous about, say, Marmas than Bengalis? And in fact, discussions in Bangladesh, it's often turned around. People say, we Bengalis were here first, the Chakmas are latecomers. All these people who are tribals came into our hills later. There's absolutely no evidence for that. And in fact, the earliest evidence we've so far found on people living in the hill tracts is actually Chakma in the 16th century.
Now in Bengali it's Adivashi, and English is indigenous. And why have the indigenous peoples asked for that? Indigenous peoples' rights is recognized under international human rights law, including the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and 2 ILO conventions, 107 and 169, and one of them, 107, was ratified during the time of Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, our founding leader. So the indigenous identity tells you that these are the people who were excluded from modern state formation and the development process. So a democratic state has to include them in a substantive manner, and that they should be part of decision making.
There is a very distinct sense of the Bengali settler community taking over not only land but also business, markets, cities, urban areas. And if you look at the leadership of the local branches of the Awami League, the BNP, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and all the major political parties of Bangladesh, you will find that it tends to be by and large Bengali settlers who are in those positions, not the hill peoples. There is no doubt that parties which are campaigning for power, they look at their grassroots support base, and the grassroots support base, even in the hill tracts, is dominated by the Bengalis rather than the indigenous peoples. And therefore, it is the interests of the Bengali settlers, the merchants, the plantation owners, and of course the civil and military officials. That is what gets prominence in the actual decision making by the government, as distinct from the rhetoric of what it claims it will do. And so in that sense, what has actually happened is quite consistent with the power structure. It is totally inconsistent with the treaty and the rhetoric of the government, but it is perfectly consistent with the situation on the ground.
আমার নাদিন বুদিন আমার খিয়া দশেন হয়ে বেড়ানো যারে কিনি তাই কে দূরে মনে হলো যাতো না যা দেন পারে তখন ওরা আর্মিয়ে যান তাই গাড়ি তোলা মেলামে রাঙামাটিও হইব লাগিল রাঙামাটিও হইব লাগ গতন হনা পড়েছি মেনে ওই গিলে চুরিছত এক চাক দূর তারপরে ইয়া ওই রাঙামাটির তো ফার্স্টে খাগড়াছড়ি জেনে যাই সুদ খেয়ে ভাই একশো এসে তো কেউ ছিল না আহি তো আগে ফলান্ড বাজা হরি বুঝি
শান্তি না দেখা যাতা যে শান্তি আর নেই যখন মানা মানিও হে হনরকম দিন হাদানা হয়ে দেয় এমন অদ্দরা নাগে তো নিত্য নিত্য বুন হাকা ইয়ান হাকা দর নিত্য মন দুর্বলতা থাই